Uh-huh. We found it. Welcome back for the Simon Peter Principles. As a reminder, this comes from a book written by Keith Hodges on the Simon Peter Principles, and I found it very interesting. Hope you do too. This is lesson 3. Lesson 1 was you never know when God's going to call you. And Peter certainly didn't know when he was going to be called because he was out fishing. And you don't like to be disturbed when you're fishing, right? Principle 2, which we had last week, was start from where you are. And we learned a lot about the man, Simon Peter, that he was a married man, homeowner, had a mother-in-law, had believing children, and was a successful businessman. And we learned a lot about Simon Peter. Well, this week we're going to look at principle 3, recognize the pivotal moments in your life. But one little thing I thought was interesting this week, isn't it interesting when science proves the Bible? Things that we've known all along that scientists finally figure out. All my life I've heard people argue about which came first, the chicken or the egg. And we all know the answer to that, don't we? Because God created animals. He didn't create eggs. He created animals. So we knew the answer all along, but scientists have argued and argued about this forever and ever. Well, finally, I saw on the news this week that they have discovered that the chicken came first. Because they have determined that chickens produce an enzyme which they have to form the shell on an egg. An egg cannot be formed without a chicken having that enzyme. And it took scientists hundreds of years to figure out what if they'd have just read the book. It says, God created animals. We knew the answer to that years ago. Isn't it amazing that they finally figure out if they would just read the book, they would have the answers? Well, we're looking at this lesson tonight. Recognize the pivotal moments in your life. Show of hands. How many of us have ever had a life-changing experience? I have. Yeah, I've had a couple of them that just totally rocked my world and changed my world. And I think if we're honest, most of us have some kind of traumatic event that made a big impression on us. And if we're honest, we probably don't want to talk about it, do we? Because it was such a big event and it changed us that we don't talk about it a lot. Well, tonight we're going to look at a few life-changing experiences in the life of Simon Bar-Jonah, Simon the son of Jonah. How many human beings have ever walked on water? We know Jesus walked on water. Is it too small? I'll make it bigger print next week. We know that Jesus walked on the water several times, but somebody else did. Simon Peter walked on water. Mark 6, 42 through 52. This is right after the feeding of the 5,000. When that's all finished, an event happened in Simon Peter's life that changed his life. So they all ate and were filled. And they took up 12 baskets full of fragments and of the fish. Now those who had eaten the loaves were about 5,000 men. Immediately, right after this, he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he sent the multitude away. And when he had sent them away, he departed to the mountain to pray. You know, Jesus did this a lot. We found that in several things we've read where Jesus went away by himself to pray. And this time he spends just about all night there. And when evening came, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on land. Now watch this. Then he saw them straining at rowing, for the wind was against them. Now about the 4th watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea, and would have passed them by. And when they saw him walking on the sea, they supposed it was a ghost, and cried out, for they all saw him and were troubled. Boy, I would be too. But immediately he talked to them and said, "Be of good cheer, it is I, do not be afraid." Then he went up into the boat to them, and the wind ceased. And they were greatly amazed in themselves beyond measure and marveled. For they had not understood about the loaves, because their heart was hardened. That's Mark's account of what happened. That's not the whole story, though. The Apostle John also records this story in John 6, starting in verse 13. Once again, talking about the loaves and the fishes. They gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves, which were left over by those who had eaten. Then those men, when they had seen the sign that Jesus did, said, "This is truly the prophet who has come into the world." Prophet. Therefore, when Jesus perceived that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he departed again to the mountain by himself alone. And when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into the boat, and went over the sea toward Capernaum. Capernaum was the region, Bethsaida was the city, so there's no discrepancy there. And it was already dark. Notice that, already dark. And Jesus did not come with them. Then the sea arose because a great wind was blowing. And when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and drawing near to the boat, and they were afraid. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." Then they willingly received him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land where they were going. Whoops, there one. Same story, 2 different tellers. Mark and John have told the story. Each would add a little bit more detail to it. One thing interesting in here, the 4th watch of the night. Night starts at 6 p.m. Each watch is 3 hours. So 6 to 9 is the first watch. 9 to midnight is the second watch. Midnight to 3 is the third watch. So what time is this happening? After 3 o'clock in the morning. It's pitch dark out there. Wow. Pitch black, rough seas, howling wind, and you see someone walking past the boat. It's no wonder they were afraid. I mean, it's rough thing. They're scared to death of the sea. The wind's howling. The seas are rough. It's dark, pitch black. It's 3 o'clock in the morning, and somebody goes walking past the boat. Yeah, and they were afraid. I would be panicked at that time. One detail in reading this that I had never noticed before. Remember Mark's account, he said Jesus saw that they were having trouble rowing. How many of you can see 4 miles in the middle of the night when the storm's going on? Now they tell us that the horizon, if we're out on the beach and looking toward the horizon, that horizon is about 4 miles away from us out there. That's as far as we can see, is to the horizon. And Jesus saw them straining rowing at 4 miles away, 3 o'clock in the morning, howling storm, rain, wind. Was this a miracle? I believe it was. And then he goes for a little stroll. He walked 3 to 4 miles out there to get to the boat where they were. I can't see 3 or 4 miles. Did you notice that neither one of these writers said a word about Simon Peter in their accounts? They told the account of the storm and Jesus walking on the water, and he got in the boat and the storm ceased and they went on to where they go. Neither one of them mentioned Peter. Wonder why that is. We'll find out a little later. Stay tuned. Matthew 14 gives the same account, but Matthew adds a little more detail than Mark and John did. Luke doesn't even include this in his gospel. Matthew. Now those who had eaten were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. The feeding of the 5,000 is a misnomer. There were a lot more than 5,000 people that were fed here. There were also women and children. If it was only double that, he fed 10,000. If you count children, it could have been up to 12,000, 14,000 people that they fed. At the least 7,000, 8,000. So when we say the feeding of the 5,000, know that he's fed a lot more than that and had a lot left over when it was all done. Now let's go back to Matthew. After they took up the 12 baskets, immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, while he sent the multitudes away. And when he had sent the multitudes away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. Now when evening came, he was alone there. But the boat was now in the middle of the sea, tossed by the waves, for the wind was contrary. Now in the 4th watch of the night, so that agrees with all of them, Jesus went to them walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, "It is a ghost." And they cried out for fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Be of good cheer. It is I. Do not be afraid." Story meshes with Mark and John up here, right? Matthew adds a little bit more. Are we surprised at who spoke up? All the men in this boat, 12 disciples in the boat, they're all there. Who's the one that's going to open his big mouth? My man, Peter. And Peter answered him and said, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And he said, "Come." And when Peter had come down out of the boat, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. But when he saw that the wind was boisterous, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, saying, "Lord, save me." And immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him, and said to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. And those who were in the boat came and worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Such an important event in the life of Simon Peter. A life-changing event for Peter. And only Matthew recorded it. Why do you think that is? Well, the author of this book gave an explanation that seems very logical to me, that makes sense to me. And what he says is, many scholars believe that Mark wrote his gospel based on facts that were told to him by Peter. We know Mark traveled with Peter. He was John Mark, went on, missionary journeys with Paul, and he also was with Peter a lot. And so he recorded things that Peter told him. You think Peter wanted to remember that night when he almost drowned, when he lost his faith in Jesus and he sank? He probably didn't tell Mark about it. Like I say, most of us who have had life-changing experience, we don't want to talk about it. That's between me and the Lord. And not a lot of people know about it. Peter probably didn't tell Mark this story, so Mark didn't write it down. News to me. Doesn't detract from the story about Jesus walking on the water. And John. Who was John? Who were the first 4 disciples that Jesus called? Peter, Andrew, James, and John. The 4 fishermen. The business partners. The good friends. Some people say they were cousins. They were all in business together. John and Peter were good friends. Do good friends tell stories about a good friend that's going to embarrass them? If I knew something that was embarrassed about Touche, I'm not going to tell you about it. That's between me and Touche. Is that okay with you? So John, he probably didn't want to embarrass Peter by writing this down, because this wasn't an incident that Peter was proud of. So John didn't write it down. Does that make sense to you? It did to me when I read that. But Matthew was one of the disciples. Where was he the night that this happened? He was right there in the boat. He was one of the 12 apostles. He was in the boat. He saw Peter get out of the boat. He wrote down his gospel, and Peter walked on the water. I saw it. He did it. He says, and then he started sinking. What was Matthew's occupation? Tax collector. A man who's accustomed to detail. Get all the numbers in all the right columns and tell it like it is, If you made a profit, we're going to talk about it. If you lost money, we're going to write that down. That's the way Matthew was. He was a trained tax collector to record the facts. And he wrote the facts. He wrote what he saw. So Peter took his eyes off Jesus and he sank. The rest of them say, truly, you are the Son of God. 3 lessons from Peter walking on the water. Simon Peter walking on the water. Number 1, Simon Peter did walk on water. He was the only disciple out of 12 of them there. He was the only one that was brave enough to get out of the boat. A whole sermon one time titled, Get Out of the Boat. Sometimes we just need to get out of this building and go do something for somebody else. We need to go somewhere and do something. Peter was the only one that was brave enough to step out. Didn't turn out real well for him, but he did get out. Lesson 2. Keep your eyes on Jesus and you're okay. He's going to protect you. As long as he was looking at Jesus, walking to him, he was okay. But if he took his eyes off Jesus, he got in trouble. Same thing with us. If we keep our eyes on Jesus and press forward toward the goal, we're going to be okay. But when we take our eyes off of him, we start falling back into old habits, old ways, and we get in trouble. Third lesson, only God can control nature. We saw that several times in the last couple of weeks, didn't we? That He controlled nature. He spun up a couple of hurricanes and sent them our way. Did our prayers affect the path of the hurricane? I like to think they did. Not only ours, not only the prayers of Creekside Church of Christ, but I think it was a great thing for the state of Florida because there were thousands and thousands of Floridians praying for that hurricane to turn. If that affected the way it went, hallelujah. But thousands of people prayed, and the fervent, effectual prayer of a righteous man avails much. Only God can control nature. But does God ever change His mind? Oh, yeah. And a lot of times the prayers change His mind. Oh, where am I? Lesson 3. Suddenly, in one story, Simon Peter goes from the hero to the goat. I mean, he got out of the boat. He was walking on the water. The only other human being ever recorded to walk on water. Hero! And then he sank to the goat in one story. So here we have Simon Peter, the wavering one, go from hero to goat in one story. A pivotal moment in his life. Another important lesson that we overlook in this story, what was Christ's attitude when one of His followers gets distracted and finds himself in trouble? Did He say, "You got yourself into this, get yourself out of it"? Isn't that what we do to a lot of people? Sometimes, when they get in trouble, we say, "You caused this, you figure out how to get out of it." What was Jesus' response to Peter getting in trouble? It says He stretched out His hand and He helped him. Christ is going to make that extra effort needed to save one of His own. We all know the story of the 99, how He leaves the 99 and goes looking for that one. When Peter sank, He didn't, leave him to get out of it himself. He stretched out His hand and He helped him. He's going to do that to us. The story is even more meaningful when we realize that Peter was a fisherman. He knew a lot about being out on the water. I love to watch the videos of one of my favorite people who wears his Tennessee hat all the time, Bill Dance. But they've got all these outtakes of Bill Dance. I don't know if you've ever watched it. He's a great fisherman, but he falls out of the boat more than anybody I have ever seen. He is all the time falling out of the boat or getting slapped in the head with a tree. That happens to people who fish a lot. You're going to fall out of the boat sometimes. No doubt Peter fell out of the boat sometime. Could he swim? Well, let's look at the story right here in John chapter 21. This is after Jesus' resurrection. Simon Peter, Thomas, called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 others, 7 people, were together. And Simon Peter said to them, "I'm going fishing." Now, this is just a personal observation of mine, but sometimes when things get overwhelming and your mind is spinning, best thing you can do is just go fishing. Just go sit out on the lake or in a boat somewhere and just get all the cares of the world. You know why they call it fishing instead of catching? You're not always going to catch something. And Simon Peter knew all about this too. He didn't catch everything, didn't catch a lot of times. He went fishing. But the best thing you can do sometimes just to clear your mind and ease things up, Simon Peter says, "I'm going fishing." Good for him. Back to the story. They said to him, this is the other 6 people, "We're going with you too. If you're going to go fishing, we're going fishing." They went out and immediately got into the boat, and that night they caught nothing. I must have been with them because that's the way I fish. But when the morning had now come, Jesus stood on the shore, yet the disciples did not know it was Jesus. Then Jesus said to them, "Children, have you any food?" And they answered, "No." And he said to them, "Cast the net on the right side of the boat, and you'll find some." Now he's telling a professional fisherman who has fished all night how to fish. Peter's been through this before, so he said, "Okay, I'll throw it on that side of the boat." So they cast, and now they were not able to draw it in because of the multitude of fish. Therefore that disciple whom Jesus loved, and we know that that's John, but this is John telling that John never called himself by name. That disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It's the Lord." Now when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he had removed it. He put his coat on, and plunged into the sea. But the other disciples came in the little boat, for they were not far out, but about 200 cubits, 300 yards, the length of 3 football fields out there, dragging the net of fish. Then as soon as they had come to land, they saw a fire of coals there, and fish laid on it, and bread. Jesus said to him, "Bring some of the fish which you have caught." Simon Peter went up and dragged the net to land, full of large fish, 153. And although there were so many, the net was not broken. Simon Peter was a man, we've heard him called the big fisherman, all right? He was no wimp. He had just swum, is that the right swim? 300 yards, wearing a coat. It's hard enough to swim in your swimsuit, but he'd put his coat on and jumped in the water, swam all the way there, and then he drags a net with 153 large fish, it says, to land by himself. That's quite a feat right there, just dragging those fish to land. But even he needed help sometimes. Have you ever gotten into a situation and suddenly realized you're in over your head? I know I have, a lot of times. Human nature is for just to be hesitant to ask for help, isn't he? Fortunately for Peter, when he started to sink, what did he say? "Lord, help me." We need to learn to say that in our lives a lot of times when we find ourselves in over our head. "Lord, help me. Get me out of this." When we need help, just ask for it. You might even be surprised. Another pivotal moment in the life of Simon Peter. Don't you guys get it yet? When you were raising your kids, for you that have kids, how many times did you tell them something and tell them again and tell them again? If I've told you once, I've told you 1,000 times. Did you ever say that to your kids? Yeah, I think all parents have said that at one time or the other. Did you get exasperated by this? Did you get just kind of, what am I going to do with you? Do you think that ever happened to the Lord? In the book of Matthew, chapter 15, a pivotal moment for Simon Peter. When he had called the multitude to himself, he said to them, "Hear and understand, not what goes into the mouth defiles a man, but what comes out of the mouth, that defiles a man." Then his disciples came and said to him, "Do you know that the Pharisees were offended when they heard this saying?" Didn't you know that you offended somebody? Have you ever offended anybody? If you hadn't, you're not trying. They said, "What you said offended somebody." But he answered and said, "Every plant which my heavenly Father has not planted will be uprooted. Leave them alone. Just walk away. They are blind leaders of the blind. And if the blind leads the blind, both will fall in a ditch." Anybody want to guess who speaks up? Then Peter answered and said to him, "Explain this parable to us." So Jesus said, "Are you still without understanding? Do you not yet understand that whatever enters the mouth goes into the stomach and is eliminated? But those things that proceed out of the mouth come from the heart, and they defile a man? Are you still without understanding? Don't you guys get it yet?" Has anybody here got an NIV Bible? Verse 16 in the NIV translated says, "Are you still so dull? Are you stupid?" Basically is what he's saying. Don't you understand? I've told you 1,000 times if I've told you once. I think he got a little exasperated with him at this point. If I can get to the next page. How would you like to be called dull, thick-headed by someone that you highly respect? By Jesus the Lord. Said, "You thick-headed thing. Don't you guys get it?" Jesus had been teaching in parables for some time now, and he'd been explaining them to the apostles. They should start understanding things about how a parable works by now, if they had been paying attention. The first time he ever taught a parable in the disciples' presence, he gave them a private explanation, not only of what a parable meant, but why he used parables. Were they expecting this every time he talked about a parable? You're going to have to explain this every time you do one? Have you ever looked at Jesus' different reactions to his disciples? Sometimes he showed unbelievable patience with their shortcomings. He took the time to explain things and train them sometimes. Sometimes he was quick to correct and rebuke them. When Simon Peter starts sinking in the water, he says, "Oh, you of little faith." He rebukes him. Sometimes he's quick to do that. He corrected them, their errors. And here he seems to show exasperation. Are you still so dull? Some people even reject the notion that a Heavenly Father, the glorious God, would ever lose his patience with us. And these are the same people that say God would never send anybody to hell. But doesn't the Bible say differently? 2 Peter 3:9. "The Lord is not slack concerning his promise, as some count slackness, but is long-suffering toward us, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance." So some are going to perish. God established rules. When he made the world, he established rules for the world. And he expects us to obey these rules right from the start. He set up some rules. In the Garden of Eden, what did he tell man? Don't eat of that tree. Here's a rule, hard and fast rule. Don't eat of that tree. They did, and they suffered the consequence. We're still suffering the consequence for that. By the sweat of our brow we make a living. Another time God got so exasperated with mankind that he threatened to wipe them off the face of the earth. It says, "And the Lord was sorry that he ever made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord." 8 people were saved from destruction. What happened to everybody else? They broke the rules. They suffered the consequences. Then God's chosen people, the Israelites, made him so disappointed that several times in their history, he allowed them to be captured by their enemies, sent off into captivity until they straightened themselves out. The most important lesson from all of these is that in every case, hear this, in every case, God made a way to redeem themselves. He never sent them off and said, You're there forever. No. If you come back and obey my word, I'll bring you back to the land of milk and honey. He gave them a way of redemption. With each discipline, there's always the underlying truth that His great love and His desire is to save mankind. What Jesus was trying to tell His disciples here was to think. Pay attention. Think for yourselves. He wasn't always going to be around to explain everything to them. They needed to start thinking. But here, once again, it was Simon Peter who took the brunt of Jesus' rebuke. Simon was seemingly always the first one to speak up. Often it got him into trouble. But Jesus recognized this, and He kept working on Simon Peter. This man is worth it. He's got great abilities. I'm going to make something out of him. I'm going to make a rock out of him. He saw value and ability in the wavering Simon to become Peter the rock. And He will do the same thing for us. He keeps working on us. And then the third pivotal moment in Simon's life was the great confession. One of those pivotal moments in the ministry of Jesus and also in the life of Simon Peter. The apostles had been out on a preaching mission. He had sent them out to preach, and they came back, and they all gathered up, and He was anxious to hear what went on while they were out there preaching. So He gathered them all together and asked them a question, and there were some real interesting answers. And then He turned the question to them. Well, let's read it. Matthew 16, 13 through 20. When Jesus came into the region of Caesarea Philippi, He asked His disciples, saying, Who do men say that I am? Or who do men say that I, the Son of Man, am? So they said, Some say John the Baptist, some Elijah, and some Jeremiah or one of the prophets. And He said to them, But who do you say that I am? Anybody want to guess who speaks up? Bingo! Simon Peter answered. I love this man. He's talking to 12 men here. Who do you say that I am? Simon's going to answer. I'm going to answer for the group. He said, You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus answered and said to him, Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah. Still calling him Simon. Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah. For flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. Listen. And I also say to you that you are Peter. You are Peter. And on this rock I'll build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. And I'll give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatsoever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Then He commanded His disciples that they should tell no one that He was Jesus the Christ. He starts off that you're Simon Bar-Jonah, but I say you are Peter. There must have been a stunned silence when Jesus first turned to those 12 men and asked the question directly to them. Who do you say that I am? The rest of them, Peter will answer. I don't have to make an answer. Peter will do it for us. But are we surprised at who spoke up with the answer? Nah. And it was the best answer in the history of the world. We can't help but wonder, after he said that, by Jesus' reaction, that Simon Peter might have had a surprised look on his face and said, Did I say that? Because what did Jesus say next? He says, Flesh and blood didn't reveal this to you, but my Father in heaven. Did I really say that? Even Jesus said Simon didn't come up with this answer himself, but God revealed it to him. Does this mean that God miraculously put words in Simon's mouth? I don't think so. It means that God had been working on him and working on the other disciples for 3 years now, through what they heard and what they saw and what they were witnesses to convince them that Jesus was the Messiah, the Son of God. Jesus said, "You are Peter." Finally, you got it right. That's a rock statement right there you just made. It's unfortunate in the translations of the Bible we've got that this passage is in there the way it is. It's been misunderstood, misinterpreted by so many religious people over history. The Catholic Church claims that Jesus was anointing Peter as the head of the earthly church. That's exactly where they get it. He was the head of the earthly church. Because Christ says, whatever you bind, will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose, going to be loose in heaven. No. Mel's looking at me funny because Mel's a Greek scholar. He understands this. Millions of people have been convinced to follow an earthly person instead of the living God. God can't be pleased with that. Jesus continues his response to Simon Peter's dramatic confession, and he finally gives us some insight into why he nicknamed Simon the Rock. Peter, Cephas. He did this months, years before when he first gave him that nickname. When he first called him 3 years prior, he says, "You will be Peter. Right now you're Simon Bar-Jonah. You will be the Rock." Finally, after 3 years, Jesus was actually describing 2 different kinds of rocks. And the words used in here are 2 different words. Matthew is the only one that records this dialogue between Jesus and Simon Peter. Matthew was a Jew. He spoke Aramaic, probably. So he wrote in Aramaic, the language of the region. But when the New Testament writers wrote the New Testament, what language did they write in? Greek. Different language, different words. The Greek was the literary language understood throughout the world. It's the Greek text that shows the distinction between the 2 kinds of stone here. Jesus says, "You are Peter," and uses the Greek word Petros. Petros, Petros, which means a pebble, a small pebble, like something you skip across the water. You're a small pebble. That's what Peter was. That's the word he used. And then he says, "Upon this rock," and uses the Greek word Petra, Petra, which means a large piece of bedrock, like the rock of Gibraltar. Peter, you're a little bitty pebble, but on the rock of Gibraltar, I'm going to build a church. On this truth that you've just spoken. Big difference. Did I get that right, Mel? Thank you. I always have to look at him. Respect him so much. He's such a scholar. Big difference between Petros and Petra. The 2 words that he uses here. You're a little guy, but on this big rock, I'm going to build a church. Now, the nickname he gave Peter was a compliment compared to what Simon meant. Simon was the wavering one. Petros indicates strength, stability. You're stable now. But in comparison with the truth that Simon Peter had just confessed, the apostle himself was small pebble. It's clear that Jesus was using a play on words. to distinguish between the man and the foundation of his church. Jesus' identity as the Christ is the foundation on which we build our church. Paul in 1 Corinthians writes in chapter 3, verse 11, "For no one can lay any foundation other than one already laid, which is Jesus Christ." There is no other foundation. And on this rock I will build my church. Not all the other names that people have given to church. I went by one other day that just said the church on their sign. I said, okay. At least that's a good name. But I get amused at some of these names people put to church. But he says, I'm going to build my church. Jesus has been building his church for over 2,000 years now, and he's still building on it. It's not built with bricks and mortar. It's built with people. It's us. So tonight we've looked at 3 pivotal moments in the life of Peter that made a tremendous impact on who he was becoming. We all had pivotal moments. I hope we take the same response to them we had. We're going to skip Principle 4 because we don't have enough weeks to get them all in. Principle 4 is, with grace comes responsibility. Last week we touched on responsibility, talked quite a bit about responsibility, and many of these thoughts are repeated in that lesson. So we're going to go to lesson 5 next time. Principle 5, there's no substitute for on-the-job training. Y'all probably know what OJT is. That you get hired and then you have to get trained to do the job. Jesus hired 12 men to do a job. He spent 3 years training them, and there's no substitute for that training. Anybody got any comments on pivotal moments? We've all had them. Don't get upset when you have one. Do what Peter did and say, Lord, help me, and he'll stretch out his hand. Appreciate your attention. Have a good week.